Welcome to our first real-world project. So in this section, we're gonna learn and use the most important third-party library that is used in almost all React projects. And that library is React Router. So with React Router, we are able to build applications with multiple pages that feel as fluid and smooth as the apps on your smartphone. And these are what we call single-page applications. And so throughout this section, we'll gain hands-on experience by building this gorgeous single-page application called WorldWise, while also using a new way of styling React applications called CSS modules. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and so let's get back to work. Welcome to our biggest project yet, which is going to be called WorldWise. And what's special about this one is that we're going to use Vite for the first time to set up this project instead of create React app. But before we do that, let's first take a quick look at the project. And here it is. So this is the WorldWise application, and for the first time, this actually looks more like a real-world product. Now, here we have this page link, or this page navigation, where we can click and it will then lead us to these different pages. Now, notice how up here in the URL bar, as we move to different pages, it actually changes. So now I'm on the pricing page, and so then it says pricing, but if I go to the product page, then there it says product. And the same on the login page. And if I click here on the logo, then we go back to basically the home page where we then are at the root URL. So basically we have these different URLs matched to different views in the application. And so this makes this a single page application. And more about that in the next lecture. But now let's actually take a look at the heart of the application. So for that, let's come to the login page. And this is actually really just a fake login where we just click this button here, which will then take us to the application. So in this application, basically users can register all the cities that they have ever traveled to. So here on the left side, we have a list of all these cities and also the countries which automatically come from the cities. And notice how actually here the URL also changes between countries and cities. So this also makes part of the routing that we will learn about in the next lecture. But anyway, here on the right side is then where we have a map, and we can go to our current position by clicking here. So this is using the geolocation API in the background. And so for that, we need to give our permission. And then after getting our position, the map will move to our current location. So let's wait for that. And there we are. Right. And now let's say that I went here to Sevilla. So I click here. And so then actually the city name gets fetched from an external API. We get our date. And then I can just say something about my trip. And then I add that to the list. So we see then we get this marker here, which we can click. And yeah, it got added to our list right here. And I can also delete cities by clicking here. So you saw here this loading spinner. And the reason for that is that this list of cities is once again fetched from a fake API, just like we used in our previous project. But anyway, we can of course also click on one of these cities, and that will then move the map there, and it will show us all the details here about the city name, the date we went there, and our notes. And even here this link to the Wikipedia article. Okay, and so that's pretty much it. So that's how this application works, and I think this is our nicest application yet, and the most real world for sure. So with that being said, let's now actually set up a new application on your computer using Vite for the very first time. So let's minimize this here. And then, just as always, we need to open up a new terminal or a command prompt on Windows and move to the folder where we want to create that project. And so now, instead of using create React app, we will do npm, so not npx. So npm create Vite. And in the future, once you start building your own applications with Vite, you will then use @latest. So to use the latest version of Vite. But here in this course, I now want you to use version 4 so that we are all using the same thing. And that's actually all the command that you need. Now, since you are using this command for the first time, it will ask you to install the Vite package. And so then you just hit enter or Y to confirm that. And afterwards, you will then see this prompt here for the project name. Okay, so since I already used Vite before, that's not showing up here on my screen, but you will have this step here between these two. So just confirm that. That will then quickly install Vite, and then here you can enter the project name. So this one, again, is called WorldWise. And then here we can select the framework that we want to use. So remember how I showed you in the beginning of the course that Vite is really quite different from Create React App. So Vite is basically more of a modern build tool that also happens to have a few templates for all these different frameworks. So we could even use vanilla JavaScript, but of course we want React. And so with our arrow keys, we can navigate to React, hit enter, and then finally to finish, we just select JavaScript here. And then that's it. So now it tells us to go into the folder and to then install the dependencies, but let's not do it that way. So let's instead open up our folder in VS Code and do it from there. So again, quickly renaming it here. Okay, let's make it a bit bigger actually. And then let's open up the terminal. And so from here, we now need to actually install the dependencies manually. So with Create React App, we didn't have to do that. So it would already then contain the Node modules folder here, but this one didn't. And so let's just type npm install or just npm I for short. And so this will then install all the packages, but it will be a lot faster than with Create React App. So there's a lot less packages necessary, apparently. So this is going to be a lot faster. But while this is installing, and actually now it already finished, but what I wanted to do now was just to take a quick look at the file structure here. So we have our Node modules again, which will contain all the libraries necessary. So React, React DOM, and a bunch of other ones that are necessary behind the scenes. Then we have also the public folder again, but this time index.html is actually outside that folder. So that's another small difference here. And the reason for that is simply that the developer who maintains this template here thinks basically that this is the best structure. So once again, React really doesn't care about this, and it doesn't even know basically what the structure here of the folder is. So remember, React really only is concerned about displaying components onto the screen. It doesn't care about the file structure, but of course we do. So let's just take a look here at our source folder. And so here we see that instead of an index.js, we have this main.jsx. So the file extension is now this JSX, which, as we can see down here, stands for JavaScript JSX. So it's pretty much the same as a JavaScript file, but Vite really needs this to be JSX files and not just JS files. So here the entry point is not index.js, but again, this file called main. And notice how this one here almost doesn't have any junk at all. So unlike the index.js file that we get from Create React App. All right, then here we also have our app.jsx file. as always. This one is just a bit different, but let's just, as always, get rid of everything. And then here I will use that snippet that we started using in the previous section to very quickly scaffold a new component. So for now, let's just write the name of the application here, just so we have something. And then let's also get rid of all this CSS. We will get some new one soon. And then here we need to remove that line of code as well. Okay, and so now we are ready to start the application. However, here is another difference. We don't do that with npm start. So instead, we can check out here that we have this dev script. And so here we need to run npm run dev. Okay, and so that's running now successfully, but notice how it actually didn't open up a new browser tab. So we need to manually do that. Now let's make this a lot smaller here, like this. And then I can just command or control click here on this link, and then it opens up our page. And you see, it is working great. And as always, let's also bring up our console here, which we are going to need all the time. And now to finish, remember how I also told you at the beginning of the course that the great thing about Create React App is that it already comes with all the important developer tools pre-installed. And the most important one of those is by far ESLint. So hopefully you saw throughout this course until this point that ESLint helped us so much and prevented so many bugs from happening. So building a React app without ESLint is a bit like coding half-blinded. So we really don't want that. And so we now need to config ESLint here in our Vite project. So again, we need to do that manually each time that we set up a new project with Vite. So that can be a bit annoying, and that's the reason why I told you that for learning, it is just good enough to actually use Create React App. But yeah, now we are using Vite, and so let's then config ESLint. Let me just show you an example here of why we need that. So let's say we define this variable and we are not using it. And so then usually ESLint would warn us by highlighting this variable here with that yellow underline. So that's what we want to get back, basically. So let's open up a new terminal here. So by clicking this button here, and so with this, we keep our application running here in this other process. So to configure ESLint, we need to install a few npm packages. So that's ESLint itself, then the Vite ESLint plugin. So vite-plugin or -ESLint. And finally, we also need to install all the React-specific ESLint rules. So that's ESLint config React app. So those are our 3 packages, and then we need to save them as dependencies. So dev dependencies with save dev. And then here, apparently I forgot the install keyword. And so let's see. So this should now install these 3 packages. And so next we need to actually config our project here to integrate with these packages. So the first step was to install those 3 packages. And the second one is to create a new file called .eslint.rc.json. And so here we can basically configure the behavior of ESLint. And in this case, what we want to do is to extend the default rules of ESLint with those React rules that we just installed. So just create an object like this, and then extends, and then React app. So again, these are the ESLint rules that we just installed before. So basically, these ones right here. So with this, we extend ESLint to work with those rules. And then finally, we also need to config our Vite project with this vite.config.js file. So in this file, we can configure all kinds of things about development and building of our project. But here, all we need to do is to now add the ESLint plugin to this array. So for that, we first import that here. So import ESLint from the Vite plugin ESLint. And then finally, we add that here to our plugins array. Give it a save, and that should then work. So our application got reloaded here a few times. There are no more errors. Here we can also close this process. And you see that now ESLint is back to working. So we get the error right here in our VS Code, and also even that warning down here in our output from the Vite development process. So let's get rid of that, because now we know that this is actually working. Great. So with this, we have Vite correctly set up. It is a little bit of work, but you just have to write down somewhere how it works and then do it every time. So that's not too bad, especially if it's a big project that you will be working on for a long time. But anyway, with this, we have our project set up. And so now we can start learning about the main concepts that we will talk about in this section, which are routing, single page applications, and React Router. So this section is all about React Router and single page applications. And so let's start by understanding what these actually are. So when we use routing in a web application, we basically match different URLs to different views in the user interface. In the specific case of React, we match each URL to a specific React component. And we call each of these matches between a URL and a component a route. Then, when one of those specific URLs gets visited, the corresponding React component will be rendered. For example, we could show this home page, so this home component, whenever a user visits the root URL of example.com. But when they go to /login on the same URL, we then show the login component. And if they log in successfully, we can then redirect them to the /app path. So to show them the app screen like this. So in this example, we have 3 routes that the user can visit: the root URL, /login, and /app, which will all render different React components. So basically, this enables users to navigate between different screens of the application by simply using links and the URL in the browser. At the same time, routing like this keeps the user interface nicely in sync with the current browser URL, which has a couple of nice advantages that we're going to discuss later. Now, this type of routing that I just described here only works this way on the client side, so in the user's browser. There is of course also routing on the server side, but not in client-side React applications like the ones that we have been building and that we will build in this section. But anyway, most front-end frameworks have these client-side routing capabilities baked right into the framework. But React is different because it relies on third-party packages for many different functionalities, and routing is one of them. So in React, routing is usually handled by this third-party package called React Router. And this is probably the most important and most used React third-party library out there. So if you want to learn React development, you need to learn React Router. The reason for that is that routing is fundamental for building something that we call single-page applications. So single-page applications, or SPAs for short, are web applications that are executed entirely on the client, so only in the user's web browser. And just like we discussed before, single-page applications rely heavily on the concept of routes, where different URLs correspond to different views. And here is how single-page applications work. Whenever a user clicks on a special link provided by the router, the URL in the browser simply changes. In the case of React, this job is usually done by React Router. Now, changing the URL will then trigger the DOM to be updated as a result. And in single-page applications, it's always JavaScript that will update the DOM and therefore the page. So, usually on a normal web page, when we click on a link, the browser will load a completely new page and then show us that new page, right? But single-page applications are completely different. The page is simply updated by JavaScript, which means that there will never be a complete page reload. And that's the whole point of the single-page application. It's the entire app in just one page, so without any hard reloads. This makes the web application feel just like a native desktop or a mobile application, which is really a fantastic user experience. Now, going back to React, whenever the URL is changed, React Router and React itself will update the DOM by simply rendering the component that corresponds to the new URL. And then, of course, the whole cycle can be repeated as many times as necessary. So each time the user keeps clicking on a router link, that will change the URL and the component that's being displayed on the screen, all without reloading the page. Now, it's quite common that some pages need to display some external data, but that's not a problem at all. Whenever that happens, a component can just load some additional data from a server, usually from some kind of web API. So, while the single-page app itself runs entirely on the client, it can always communicate with a server in order to fetch some data that it needs, just like we have been doing before in other applications. What we cannot do is to load a completely new page, because then it would no longer be a single page app. Now, we could actually say that all React apps are in fact single page applications, because all of them are never reloaded, right? So think of all the apps that we have built up until this point. They were all apps where React updated the DOM, and so they didn't have to reload ever. However, in a professional application, that's just not enough. So big and complex applications rely on URLs and need the routing capabilities that I described in this lecture, because only then they can become real single-page applications. And so with that being said, let's now finally go back to code and start implementing our own real single-page applications. Okay, so now that we know what routing and routes are, let's use the React Router library for the very first time. So in order to implement some routes for the main pages in our application. So with routing, we now want to associate basically specific parts of the URL to specific components in our application. So if we had, for example, this root URL and then /product, then we would want to display a product component here. So right now with this, of course, nothing happens. So our app still looks exactly the same, but now let's change that. So we will define a route for this URL and for a couple other ones as well. So to start, let's actually create the pages, so the components for the pages. And for that, I will create a new folder inside our sources, and I will call this one pages. So pages is for these structural components that we will then match to these URLs. And let's start with the product page. So product.jsx. And then let's again use that snippet to be a bit faster. And then here I will really just write something very simple. So we will get all the content into styling for each of our pages a bit later, but for now I'm really only concerned about making our routes work so that you can learn how to use React Router in a very simple way. So let's close this one here and let's create just a few more pages. So let's do the home page. And let's actually use now WorldWise here. So the name of the app. And then let's also create a pricing page. Okay. And so with this, we have 3 pages. And so we can create 3 routes for them. And so that's what we'll do next. So let's open up again a new terminal here so that we don't have to finish the current process. And then let's install our React Router package. So npm install React Router, and then very important, it needs to be the one for the DOM. Now, if we just installed this, then it would of course install the latest version, which in the future, when you build your own apps, that's what you're going to do. But for now, in this project, we will want to make sure that we're using version 6 so that your code will work exactly the same way as mine. So let's install that. And that was pretty fast. Okay, now since React version 6.4, there are 2 big ways of defining routes in our code. And we are going to use the more traditional approach, which is basically to define our routes in a declarative way. So what this means is that basically we will use a couple of special components that React Router gives us to define our routes right in the JSX. So that sounds confusing, and so let's just do it. So we start by using the browser router. So browser router, and then again VS Code suggests us this import. And so if we hit then enter, you see that browser router has been brought in here from React Router DOM. So make sure you have that line of code right there. And then let's keep going. So now in there, we need the routes component. And again, make sure that it has been correctly imported here. And now finally, we do the actual route definition. So we need all of these other components here. But then now we can finally use the route component. And so this is where we define basically the URL, which is called the path prop. And then for each path, of course, we will be able to define one component. And here, let's start with product. So the one that we already have here right now. And then here, we need to define a React element. So not just the name of a component, but really a React element, which we get by using the component. So here we want to use the product component. So that page that we created right here. And so then we need to bring that in here. So import product from, and then we need to step into the pages folder and get product from there. All right, then we need to close this route component right here. And now I saved it, and then we got this error here, which is just because I didn't bring in the route component here. But now as I save, watch how it actually already automatically went to the product component. So great. But let's keep going here, and then we will analyze this further and really try to understand what is happening there. So now let's also do the pricing path. And here now we need then the pricing component, or actually the element. And we use an element here because this way we will be able to pass props into this element. So it could also be component, which it used to be before version 5, or before version 6, actually. So then we would just do this. So basically just passing in the entire component, but then it would be very hard to pass in some props. And so with this, that's a lot easier. So just duplicating that line here. And actually, let's do it again for the home page that we need next. Here we need to just close that. And then let's do the home page here at the very top. So here the path is just the root path, basically. And then the element that we want is, of course, our home page. And of course, it could be any other name, but that's just a page name that I like. Okay, and now let's try this out. So we already saw that now we have our product component right here. And so let's check that out in our component tree. And so now we get all these components that we have here right inside our component tree, plus a few other ones. But mainly we have our browser router, the router, then the routes that we wrote into our code, and finally the product component. So what React Router did was to take a look at the URL here, and so then it saw that we had product here. And so then it saw all these different routes that we defined here, and it then selected the one that matches that part of the URL. And so that's product, and so then this element here will be displayed here in the UI. And these other two are basically disregarded. Let's try another one here. So pricing, and that of course will show us our pricing component. And finally, if we remove everything and go back to the root URL, then we get WorldWise. Beautiful. So with this, we have our first routes defined. Now let me just show you something here. So let's say we had some div around all of this, and then here we had some h1 element with something. And so then, well, that's a bit too big. So then this part here, this h1, would always stay in the page. So this one is always here, but then the router chooses between one of these paths, so one of these three routes, and then here below that will display this part. So now if we had, for example, here pricing, then you see the hello router part stays the same, but then it's as if this part here was replaced by the pricing. So if you had a part of the page that you really want to always stay the same, then this is how you would do it. But usually what we do is to just have our app component basically deciding which page should be displayed in the UI. So that's all this component here is going to do. It will not really have its own output. All it will do is, as I just said, displaying here one of the pages, which is the one that matches the route. Let's just decrease this here a little bit. And now to finish, let me just show you another thing. So let's create here another page called page-not-found.jsx. And then let's say not found here for now. And so what we can do now is at the end, create a route with the path set to this star. And so this will basically catch all the routes that were not matched to one of these other three. And so this is how we basically implement a page not found. Then closing this route. And of course, now we need to bring that in. Not found. All right. So again, this last route here with the star will basically be matched if none of the other routes are matched. So this then catches like any URL that is not matched by our routes. So let's say this one, and then we get not found, which makes sense because none of our routes really match this URL here. But of course, if we go back, let's say to the root, then we get back to our home page. Great. So at this point, we have basically half of the single page application. So we already have all our routes, but at this point, we cannot really transition from them without a page reload. So all we are doing here is to manually change the URL, and then our application goes to that page. But of course, that's not what we want. So we want that single page app feeling where we can seamlessly transition between pages. And so that's what we will implement in the next lecture by linking between these pages. So let's now create some links between our different routes in order to really turn our application into a single page application. So to start, let's say that on our home page, we want a link to the pricing page. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's try with the most obvious idea that we might get, which is to simply create an anchor element here. So basically creating a link in the traditional way. So let's wrap this here into an h1. And then after that, as I was just saying, let's just create an anchor with the href property and maybe pointing to pricing. Now let's close that. Okay. Now that's really huge again, right? But anyway, let's now try to click this and see what happens. So it actually did move to that page. But if you watched closely, then maybe you noticed that the whole page actually reloaded. So let's see that again. And so let's notice what happens really when I click here. So the page got reloaded, as we can also probably see here in our network tab. So if we select all here and then do this and come back and clear this. So again, I click here and you see that all these different requests have been made. And so this is not what we want. We don't want any hard refreshes of our page, but instead we want to seamlessly move from one page to the other simply by replacing the DOM content here on our page. So this is not what we want. So let's get rid of it. And instead, we will now use the link element that is once again provided by React Router. So let's do that. And let's make sure that it's got imported. And now here we can use the to prop. And so this is where we then specify /pricing. And it's important that we specify the slash here so that our URL always starts from the root. So basically we get root/pricing. Okay, so let's go back and let's reload here. And now watch what happens as I click here down there. So I click, we moved to another page and we got no new requests except this SVG here for some reason, but that really doesn't matter. So the only thing that really happened was that our DOM got replaced. And we can also see that nicely in our component tree now. So let's go back. So now we have our home page. And as I click here, notice that the only thing that changed was that immediately here our component tree changed. Okay, and so that's how we use the link component from React Router to seamlessly transition between pages, making this now a single page application. Great. So we can move now from the home page to the pricing page, but what about all these other pages? Well, let's just implement a page navigation, which we can then reuse in all these pages here so that we can transition between them. So that's going to be a new component, but not a new page. And so let's come here and create a new folder called components. And so this is where we will then create our page nav.jsx component. So let's scaffold that. And now here we don't want a div, but a nav component. And then let's do an unordered list. And then inside each list item, we are going to have one link to one of the pages. So again, coming in here from React Router DOM, very important to not forget that. And then let's do one link to the home page. And then I will just duplicate this a few more times. So we have also pricing. And let's do the product page. All right. And so now this is a reusable component that we can include into every single one of our pages. So let's do that right here before the H1. And we could actually also include that right here in the app. So that would be perfectly valid as well. So basically placing that right here. But the pages that I built and that we will include here a bit later actually only work if we have the navigation inside each of them. And so that's what we will then do now. So just as I was saying. So let's include that here, page nav. And this time here, VS Code is actually nice enough to automatically import that here. So let's do it actually in all of them. So let's include that right here. And now this is not in its own element, but well, that doesn't really matter, especially not in that component right there. And here, let's just place that in some H1 element. And then let's copy the same thing also to product. Or actually, you know what? It's best not to do that because then we have to manually include the component and that's too much work. Okay, and so let's see. Again, making it a bit smaller. And now, yeah, beautiful. So we can really now seamlessly navigate through our application and nothing reloads and it feels just really nice. So our URL updates here. And therefore, if we now reload at exactly this place, then the page that we get back is back at pricing. And so this then allows us to, for example, share this URL with some other users or to even bookmark this page. And it will then each time come back to this exact page. And so that's really, really helpful. Now, one thing that we do many times in navigations like these is to display which is the currently visited page. So for example, highlighting right now the pricing page since this is the page that we are visiting. And so actually React Router gives us a tool for that. So instead of using link, we can use the nav link element. So nav link like this. Then let's remove this one and replace all of them with nav link. And so once again, I just selected all occurrences here with this shortcut. So this one I use all the time. Really, really important for any development, React or really anything else. And so now it works exactly the same thing as before, but if we inspect this element, then we see that, well, if we had some space, so then we see that the currently active page gets this class of active. And so then in our CSS, we can select this class and style this element differently. So this other link, for example, the home, that one does not get this class. So if we change to product, then it will be product who has that class. Now, for now, we don't have any CSS yet because we will learn how to use a different way of incorporating CSS into a project this time. But later, once we have that, then we will be able to style this active class. And speaking of CSS, that will actually be the topic of our next lecture. So how we can use different ways of CSS in our applications. And so let's move there right now. One important part of building web applications is, of course, to style them with CSS. Now, up until this point, we have always just included a global external CSS file into our applications, and then used the class names from there in our JSX. However, in this project, we will do something a bit different, which is to use CSS modules. But before we do that, I want to take a minute to quickly explore all the different options that we can use to style React applications, because there are actually a lot of them. But first, you might be wondering, why are there actually so many different ways of styling a React app? Well, it's because one fundamental philosophy of React is to be unopinionated in regards to many common aspects of building web applications. And so one of them is styling. So React really doesn't care about how you style your applications. And so as a result, we have lots of different styling options, most of them being provided by third-party libraries. So the first option is one that we have used a few times in the beginning, which is to simply apply some inline CSS to JSX elements using the style prop. And this is actually more common in React than in regular HTML because of React's idea of separation of concerns. Now, an inline style is scoped to the particular JSX element that it's applied to, which means that it is locally scoped. So it applies only to that exact element. Now, we have also multiple times included an external CSS file and then simply applied the CSS classes using the class name prop. And the same would actually also have worked for a Sass file. Now, in this case, our styles are actually global, which means that every single JSX element in the entire application could use any of these classes in the external CSS file. And this can create huge problems, especially in big projects. For example, because you won't know which components are using which classes. And when you then update one of the classes, it will have repercussions in other components. Or when a developer adds a new class with a name that already exists, that will create clashes between those two classes. So basically, global CSS is a nightmare in large apps. So in professional projects, CSS is almost never global. Instead, CSS should be scoped to an individual component, which brings us to the next styling options, which is CSS modules. CSS modules are pretty similar to regular CSS files, with the difference that we write just one CSS file for each of our components. The styles in that file will then be scoped to only that component so that no other component can use them. And this then makes the components way more modular and reusable. And at the same time, it better reflects React's separation of concerns. And in fact, this is exactly what we will do in this project. Now, if you want to take it even one step further, you can go with a CSS in JavaScript library like styled components. So, as the name says, with CSS in JavaScript, you actually write your CSS inside a JavaScript file. So, in the same file where you define your components. What's special about a CSS in JavaScript library is that it allows us to create React components that have our styles directly applied to them, which we can then use just like regular components. So this fully embraces the React philosophy that a component should contain all the information about its appearance, and so that includes CSS. And finally, you can also use a utility-first CSS framework like Tailwind, which is getting more popular every day. So in Tailwind, you use predefined utility classes to define individual styles, to use Flexbox, to make layouts responsive, to make hover effects, and really to design your entire UI. And all that without ever having to leave the JSX markup. Okay, now finally, you do actually have one more option here, which is basically to not write any CSS at all. Wait, what? No CSS? Well, it is actually possible, because you can build your entire project using a fully fledged UI component library, for example, like Material UI, Chakra UI, or Mentine. So essentially, a component library like those contains all kinds of pre-built and pre-styled components that are common in most web applications. This is, however, not ideal for beginners, but again, it might be worth exploring later. And there you have it. So these are the different ways in which we can style React applications. And so in this project, we will now explore CSS modules. Let's now learn all the fundamentals of CSS modules that we need, which is actually really easy. So luckily for us, CSS modules already come out of the box, both with Create React App and Vite. So there's nothing to install in order to make CSS modules work. Now, as we just learned in the previous lecture, what we do with CSS modules is to create one external CSS file per component. So let's do that here for this page navigation. So right here in the components folder, we will create a new file. And now this file needs to follow the convention of the name of the component. So page nav. And then the important part is that here we add .module.css. And so this is now the CSS module for the page navigation component. And so now here we can define some classes. So let's, for example, create a nav class. And then I will just write some very simple styles here. And let's say justify content space between, just so we have some styles that we can see. Now here really we need to define class names. So we cannot use the element selector like this, for example. So for example, removing the bullets here from this list by using the UL selector is not going to work. Okay, now if we save this, then you see that of course nothing changed here for now, and that's because we still need to use these class names now in our markup. So we have to connect these two files by basically importing these styles here into this page nav component, and then as usual we add these classes that we define here to our elements. Import, and then all the classes that we define in the module are basically exported into this one big object that we can then use. And usually we call that simply styles. Okay, so the same folder and then page nav.module.css. All right, and so now this nav class that we defined here is available on styles.nav. And so here we define our class name, and now that is no longer a string like we used to do up until this point, but now we need to enter JavaScript mode to then use styles.nav. And if we save this now, we see that some styles here have been applied. Well, not really what we wanted. So yeah, here Flexbox actually makes no sense, but it makes sense in the list. So right here, and for some reason, it seems like the styles here have actually been applied. So this does work, but it's a really bad idea, because this will then select all the UL elements on the entire application, which defeats the whole purpose of CSS modules where these styles here, so these classes, are supposed to only be applied to this component. So never use the normal element selector, but here instead we will now basically select all the unordered lists that are inside our nav class. And so then here, just to test this one, let's add some orange red background color, and there we go. So here we have a nice ugly navigation now styled with CSS modules. Now notice how here we got this really weird class name. And so this is what CSS modules does. So they take our class name that we defined ourselves, and then they attach like this random ID here to the end. And so if we then create another nav class in some other CSS module, that will get a different random ID. And so then these are in the end different classes again. So down here we can then see the styles that have been applied. And indeed, there is our background color. And then here the same. So here we see that we got this same weird class name, which comes out of this one that we created here. And so now let me show you how this can really avoid naming clashes. So a problem where we or another developer on the team might accidentally create a new class name that already exists, which might then mess up all the other ones. So the other elements that use that class name. So that's a common problem when we use global CSS like we have been doing. But so let's now avoid that. And in order to do that, let's first create a new page here, which will be called app layout. So because we already have a component called app. And so this will basically be for the main application where we have that list on the left side and the map on the right side. So let's then add another route for that page right here, or actually in the app file. And so let's just duplicate this. And here the path will be app and then app layout. Okay, importing that. And now here I will not add that to the main navigation, but instead let's change the link here on the home page. So here we now move to pricing, but let's go to app. So go to the app. And so now if we go home and then click here, that should go to the app. But I just remembered that we actually haven't added any content here. So now let's do that. And there we go. So now we have another route working in our application. And now let's also create a navigation for this app. So that's going to be a new component. And so let's call this one the appNav.jsx. And let's right away also create the CSS module. So appNav.module.css. All right. And again, these are just basically placeholder components that we will replace later with the actual content. So let's just use a nav here, and then I will just write app navigation. All right. Then let's include that here. So like this, and make sure that it correctly imported. And then maybe some other element here. And so indeed, we now get both of them there. But what I really wanted to do now was to create here another class with exactly the same class name as we have in this other navigation. So this one right here. So I will now again create a nav class, and this one will have a background color of Rebecca purple. All right. Now, of course, we need to then come back here and import that. So just like before, import the styles object from appNav.module.css. And by the way, here we could also immediately destructure this object. So for example, into nav, because that's the class name that we defined. And so then here we could just do class name is equal nav. And so there it gets its other color of purple. Now here this was just to demonstrate you, because actually I don't like doing this, because then you don't know that they're coming from your styles. And when you have a lot of these curly braces inside your JSX and a lot of variables, then it's nice to know that these ones here are scoped to the styles object. Now to really see that this works, we should actually include this appNav inside some other page. So let's actually open up again this here. So let's say right in the home page, so below the page nav, let's also include now the appNav, even though we will not really need it here. But anyway, now we get both of them here. And so now I can show you in here that both of them start with the nav class that we gave them, but then we have here this unique string attached to it. And so with this, these two classes are actually now unique, which allows them to have different styles, even though we gave them exactly the same name here in our modules. Okay, and now let's talk about global CSS, because sometimes we of course do need some CSS that is really global, like a global reset or setting some font properties on the body. So some stuff that we usually do in a CSS file. And so for that, we can actually keep including an external CSS file like we have been doing all this time. So to do that, let's now actually get our starter files. So let's come here to our starter files. And this time I want to copy the entire starter folder into our project folder, so that we can then take out some files slowly over time. And starting now with index.css. So let's grab this one and place it into our source folder as usual. And then let's close this down and come here and include our CSS file right into main.jsx. So just like we have always been doing. So import index.css. Like this. And immediately you see that our styles here changed a lot. So we now got the special font family here, which I included from Google Fonts up here. And we have some global styles about input elements, and then here this global reset. And that's it. So all this global file has are basically the definition of the CSS variables, which are going to be global. And yeah, then basically these resets, but no class names anywhere to be seen. All right. And now let's close some of these files here. So as we start working with multiple files, at some point we have then many of them open at the same time, which can become a little bit annoying. But anyway, what I want to do now here at the end, since we are already speaking about global CSS, is to show you how we can define some more global CSS also inside CSS modules. So let's say that here we wanted a test class, let's say with the background color of red, which for some reason we wanted to include into our homepage, but without importing this module. So let's open that homepage right here. And so again, let's say that now I wanted to do class name and then test. So just a regular way, so attempting to use a global class name here. So this really wouldn't work right now, because as we already know, this class that we just exported from the CSS module is now prefixed, or actually it got added to the end like this random ID like this, right? And therefore our homepage here cannot read just the test class. So that's the whole reason why we have to export our classes here into the styles object and then use it like this. But again, let's say that now we wanted to use it like this. So basically we wanted to create a global test class. So we could do this by using this global function and then wrapping our selector in there. And so now as we save this, then this test class gets global as the name says. And so now our h1 here can access the test class without that weird string attached to it in the end. Now this is not really helpful, but it was important to show you how this global function works, because now we can use this in order to style the active link like we have been talking about before. So remember how the page that is currently active gets the active class attached to it. So like this. Now, if we were trying to do this, so .nav and then selecting the active class in there, this wouldn't work. So let's try that with a blue, or maybe better a green background color. And so you see that indeed it has the active class name, but it doesn't work. And so that's because, again, CSS modules will see this class here and it will then add that random string to it. And so then that class will be different from that one. And so the solution to that in a case like this is to use global. And now that works. So now we get our green background. And if we click here, then it moves there. And here the same thing. Okay, so this global function here is usually mostly important when we are working with some classes that are provided from external sources. So in this case, the active class is given to us by React Router. And so then if we want to style that, we need to use this global thing. So otherwise, if we just want to define some global classes, we wouldn't do it inside a module, but just inside our global CSS file, which is this one. All right. And so this is actually all that I wanted to show you about CSS modules. There's also something else, which is called composing classes, but I think that's not really important. So we're not going to talk about that here, because this is really all you need to know in order to effectively use CSS modules in your own projects. And of course, also in this one. So now that we know the fundamentals of both the technologies that we're going to use in this project, so that's React Router and CSS modules, we are now ready to build the actual pages of the application. And so let's now go do that. And what I mean by actual pages is these pages that we saw before in our demo. So with the actual content and styling. And remember that those are, again, the homepage. So this one that we already implemented. We have the product page, the pricing page, and the login page. Well, this now brought us to the application, but if we log out and then log in again, then this brings us to this login page. So these four are the ones that we are going to implement. And then in the next lecture, we will implement the application layout. So with the sidebar, this menu right here, and the map. All right. Now, of course, we are not going to write the content and the styling here ourselves, but instead we get them from the starter files that we already copied into our project folder. And so now let's take a closer look at what we actually have there. And I want to do that in the File Explorer because that's a bit easier. So we have the starter folder right here, and we have a couple of images, and then these three folders. Now, let's start by dragging the data folder out here, so into the root folder of our project. And then let's also grab these four images and drag them into the public folder. So just like we have been doing before, we will use images from the public folder. So not from this assets folder that we also have inside the sources folder. So the assets here are to be directly imported into our JavaScript code. So if we want to do that, then we place them here into this assets folder. But that's actually not what we want. So let's just delete that folder actually. And so then finally we have components and pages, which we also have in our starter files. So in this lecture, we are going to take care of the pages. And so let's now grab everything that we have here and copy into the pages folder that we already have. So we will basically overwrite a few files, or most of the files that we already have there. So these pages, they were just dummy content. And so now let's replace all of them. So we got again our pricing, product, login page. And now what's different is that we have now our corresponding CSS module files. So let's quickly check them out back in VS Code. So you see that our pages folder has indeed changed. Let's then close everything we have here and open them again, because in the meantime, these files have changed. And let's start with the homepage and then also opening up the corresponding module. And then I'm going to close the sidebar, this time using Command or Control B. So otherwise, we really don't have enough space here. All right, so our homepage now looks like this. And you see it has exactly this content here in terms of the markup that we have here, except for this link, but we will add that here in a second. So we also already have our styles, which is coming from the CSS module. So just like we learned before, we are importing our styles object from this module right here. So here we have all these styles. So we have a homepage class, which we are using right here. And then we have all these other styles that are necessary for this page. And so with this, let's check out what our page looks like at the moment. So that's already a bit similar, so not bad. Let's just try to reload. And apparently we have already an error here, which says that our background image could not be found. So here we should probably remove these two dots. And that still doesn't work. So let's check out if this image is actually in our public folder. And well, it is not. So let's come back to our starter files here once again and grab that from here into our current public folder. All right. Let's try that again here. And beautiful. So now that works. And if you find these going back between the starter files and our own files a bit confusing, then let me just mention that I decided to have so many pre-built files here for two reasons. First, it's to save us a lot of time so that we don't have to type all these styles and all this markup here on our own. And second, it is also to prepare you more for a real job. So for a job where you will collaborate with other developers. And so in this example, we can pretend that some other developer on our team, which is more of a designer, prepared all these CSS modules for us and also these React components, so that then we, as a true React developer, can add the data and the logic and really put it all together in a nice application. So in this project, I actually really want you to imagine that you are now working on a team. And so you are the React developer who builds this application based on some files that you already got from some other member of your team. All right, but now let's then complete this homepage that our designer friend or colleague gave us and add that button down here. So this one right there. So this button or this link actually should take us to the app page, so to the app layout component. And so this should be a link. So one of those links from React Router. So again, this will take us to the app page. And here, actually, we are now using a global class name, which is the CTA class. And then start tracking now. And then, of course, we need to bring in the link from React Router DOM. And so now that works. So about this global class name, this one is located in our index.css file. So before I said that we didn't have any global class names in here, but actually later I added this one. So because we need this in multiple places, and so I didn't want to declare this inside of one CSS module. So we have that here, and then we can just use it as usual in all the components that need it. And so now we linked here to this app layout page, which actually hasn't changed. So this one we didn't overwrite. And so when we click here now, then we get to that page that we built before. Nice. So next up, let's take care of the logo here. So here we have this logo, which is actually part of this entire navigation. So here in the home page, we now want to get back that navigation that we already started to build. And so that's going to be inside this main element. So then we have the page nav and also this section element then. So let's bring that in. And here we have now to go up one level so that we can then move into the components folder and then grab that from there. And here it is. It looks pretty bad right now, but so let's go fix that. So that's page nav. And now here we are using this nav class right now, which gives us this purple background. But actually we do have a starter file for that as well. So that's right here in this CSS module. So let's drag that in here, replace. And so immediately you saw that it changed there. So let's open that up. But actually this is not the one that we want. So we actually want the page nav, right? So let's grab that one, replace it as well. And here I notice that I imported the wrong one. So again, that's the kind of thing that happens when you start working with all these different files. But that's just how it is in React development. And these are actually not that many files yet. So later on, we will have hundreds of files as we start working in our next big project. So, but anyway, let's now open up this component because this is going to be our next task that we need to work on. So building now this page navigation. And actually, this is already looking pretty well. So what we should do is to add another nav link here for the login page. So this one will move us to the login page. And then actually in our real app here, we don't have a link for the homepage, but instead that homepage will open as we click here on this logo. So let's remove this one here. And then let's bring in the logo that we already have once again in our starter components. So the logo and the corresponding module, let's select them and then place them into our components folder. So here it is. And then let's just include this here besides the unordered list. So this nav will have two children, the logo, and then the UL. So make sure it got correctly imported. And beautiful, there it is. So our navigation is working fine. We didn't include it here yet, but it is working. But now the only thing that we need to do is to actually include a link in this logo here. So right now we see that it's not a link yet. And so let's open up the logo by clicking here on this component. So Command or Control clicking, or of course, you can also open it right there. So here we return this image, as you see. And so let's just wrap this into a link. So this link coming again, of course, from React router. And then here we simply go to the root URL. Okay. Give it a save. And so this time we are actually using a link and not a nav link because we don't want to add any special styles when this is selected. So that's really not necessary here. And so with this, we finish our logo. And so now when we click here, of course, we stay on the same page. But now let's go to one of these other pages and then add the navigation there. And then we will see that this link also works. So let's open up these other pages. So that's the login page, the pricing page, and the product page. So all these pages will get that navigation. So here we see we already have some problems. So that's because we're using useState that is not imported. So let's quickly get that. So import useState from React. And so you see that our designer colleague here had a small mistake in his code. So this is where we need that page nav component. Right. So make sure that it got imported. And now we just do the exact same thing in all the other ones. So we want our page nav here. And there it is. And finally, also here in the pricing page, give that a save. And with this, we should be finished. So we can go to the pricing page and it becomes active. Product, login. Well, this one was not found. I guess we didn't create that yet. And then finally, we also have the WorldWise image logo where we can click and then we move there. Beautiful. So let's see. And indeed, I see that we don't have a route yet for our login page. So let's add that here. And I like to keep the order of the routes here in the order that the links appear up there. And so let's create ourselves a new route with the path of login like this. And then here the element that we need is, of course, the login page that we just worked on. Okay. And now let's once again import that here. And there we go. Now the only thing that I want to do here is to also add basically this green button there. And so here in this special link, so only in this one, let's add the class name that is coming from styles.cta link. Okay, and there we go. So let's just move here quickly to that file to check out that class. And so here we have that CTA link. And notice how here we are using basically the JavaScript way of writing the variable instead of the normal CSS way, which would be like this. And the reason for that is that a class name like this would be a lot harder to then get into our JSX. So when we're writing CSS modules, we usually define our class names like this. So in this kebab case style, I think it's called. And so, yeah, then we include it right there. And with this, we finished our navigation and we finished all our pages. We will take care of this button here a bit later. And so, yeah, now everything works fine. And so next up, let's take care of building the layout here in this main application part. Next up, let's build the static layout of the main application screen. And to start, let's actually take now all of our starter components here and move them into the component folder that we already have. And this can be a bit difficult inside VS Code. So if you find it easier to do in the File Explorer, then just go do that there. But anyway, with this, we now no longer need this folder. So let's finally delete that. And with this, we are done handling all of these starter files. So let's close up this one. And now we have, as you see, a lot of different files here. And what some projects do is to create a folder for each of the components. For example, here, this country item, we would create a folder just for this and then place the component itself, the CSS module, and maybe even some other files in there. For example, like a test file. But here, let's just keep it simple with a flat file structure, and we will just deal with having all these files here. But anyway, let's now open up our app layout.jsx file so that we can now start working on this part. So basically what we want to achieve in the end is to having this sidebar here and this map. All right. And so basically we will now create these two components first. So let's do that here inside our components. So sidebar.jsx, and then also let's immediately do map.jsx. All right. And so starting with the first one, we use again our snippet here. And so then let's start working here on the sidebar. So first of all, this will get the class of sidebar. And so that class is actually inside the module that is already here for this sidebar component. So this class right here. And so let's again start by getting in those styles. And I will actually show you an easier way of importing this a bit later. But for now, let's just keep doing this. .css. And now we can come here and use styles.sidebar. And now here we want to bring in our logo again. So just as we can see there on the right side, then we also have the app nav. So that's this component that we also already created. Then we will have that list of cities, which we don't have yet. And so for now, let's just write that here. List of cities. And then finally down here, we also have this kind of footer. And for this, let's actually just use the HTML footer element. So without creating a new component, which I guess might make sense, but I just wanted to keep our list of components here a little bit shorter. So if you want, you can totally, as an exercise, do that. So creating a new footer component and then also exporting the styles that we're going to need here to a new CSS module. So that would be footer.module.css. So then taking these two styles into that other module. But again, I will just keep those here to keep it a bit simpler. And now here, let's create a paragraph with styles dot copyright like this. And then let's just do copyright, and then new date and get full year so that we dynamically calculate the current year here, and then by world Wise Inc., let's say. So completely made up company. And yeah, I just realized that it would be a lot nicer to have this in its own component. And so as I was saying before, please do that now as a challenge, while I will simply leave it here to keep it simple. Okay, and now let's remove all of this from here. And let's then include the sidebar that we just built. Okay, and that's looking a lot nicer already. We are just missing some layout here, and that's just because we are still missing our style here. So we need to import that again, but now let me show you an easier way. So using again a snippet. So come here to our index.css file where I placed this snippet code for you. So please copy that, at least if you want to use this snippet, and then come again to user snippets where we already placed some other ones. So you've been using this one, and so right afterwards, let's paste that code. And so now we will have a snippet which we can use with this prefix of CSM. So that stands for CSS modules, and that will then automatically import those styles for us. So save this, close it, close this one as well, and then use CSM, and there we go. So it automatically uses again the file name here, and so now we can just use the styles object. So styles.app, and beautiful. So now we have our sidebar here on the left side, and on the right side we are going to have that map. And so that's coming here from this Flex container. All right, so let's then build this map. And for now, here we will just write map and then also use some more styles. So our snippet CSM, and you see this makes it really a lot faster. So then here it is map container, and then let's include this right here as well. So map, and choosing this one so that it automatically gets included, and nice. So there we have it, and you see that we are not doing any composition here in this case. So our sidebar contains a couple of elements and components which we could have just passed in here as children components in this case. So just like we have been doing before. But since we are not passing any props here anyway, let's just keep this page here very clean. So I usually like to do that. So having the pages without much stuff in them so that most of the code is actually inside my components folder. So then this page, basically all it does is to just add some styles to the page, and then it includes all the components that are necessary. Let's just remove that code there. And with this, we are actually finished. And so now with the static layout in place, it's time to go back to learning a bit more about React Router. So let's now move back to React Router and learn about probably the most confusing part of declaring routes, which are nested routes. So we need nested routes when we want a part of the user interface to be controlled by a part of the URL. So in this case, here in this part of the sidebar, right now we are showing this list of cities. And so notice how here in the URL we have /app and then /cities. And so basically this cities part here is displayed because in the URL we have cities. So watch what happens when we click here. So you see that now this last part of the URL has changed to countries. And so then we are displaying this list of countries here. And the same thing happens when we click on the map. So then here we get /form. And never mind the last part here. What matters is that we got form. And so then in that case, we display this form. And then we can go back to the cities, and then we have our cities list again, which corresponds to this part of the URL path. So nested routes are basically to implement exactly this behavior. So where we show a part of the UI based on some part of the URL. Now note how nested routes are not simply routes which are made up of multiple parts like this one. So just because we have a longer path with these two parts, this doesn't make it a nested route. Instead, this is actually a nested route because this path here influences what component is rendered inside this bigger component. So in this case, this city list is rendered inside this big app layout component. Okay, and so now let's do that in our code in our own application. So we want to now declare a couple of nested routes, and we do that basically inside a route element. So in this case, let's come to this route here for the app, which is this first part of the URL here. And so now it's as simple as removing this closing part and then closing the route element like this, so that now we can create some nested routes in here. So basically child routes of this parent route. So let's do that. And let's use the path of cities. So exactly what we have right there. And then the element that we want to display here doesn't actually need to be a component. So really, this is just any JSX element. So we can just for now create some paragraph here until we have that city list component. So let's just write list of cities here. And then let's close this route as always, give it a save, and then let's do another one. So another child route, and let's use the countries path here. And then let's display again just a simple paragraph like this. And notice how here in the path description, we actually don't have to include the parent path. So React Router is smart enough to basically combine these two. Okay, and now let's just create one more for the form. And again, just a very simple paragraph right here. Now just close this route. And with this, for now, we are done. So we now have our three children routes here. And with this, we are actually done. So we have defined three child routes of this app route right here. But now, where are these elements like this one or this one actually going to be displayed in the UI? Or in other words, how are we now actually going to display one component or one element inside another component? Well, that's where the outlet component provided by React Router comes into play. So where do we actually want to display these elements? Well, they should be inside the sidebar. So right here, instead of this hard-coded paragraph that I created here. And so in this place is where we are now going to use that outlet element. So let's give it a save. Let's check this out, and then I will explain exactly what has happened here. So as we reload, we see nothing here, but then let's try to manually write cities. And there it is. So there is our list of cities paragraph that we defined right here for this children route. So for this nested cities route. So let's see what actually happened here. So React Router saw this URL here made out of these two parts. And so first it saw the app part. And so that then matched this route right here. But then the router noticed that there's also this cities part. And so then it went into these nested routes. And so then of these three here, it selected the first one to be rendered. And so then it did basically render this part. And where did it render this part? Well, it placed it right here into the outlet element. And so this is actually pretty similar to the children prop if we think about this. So it's similar to this right here whenever we pass some element inside another element in JSX, with the difference that here we are not using elements but routes. And so of course the children prop is not going to work, but instead we use something similar, which is the outlet element. So of course if we now change this to form, so not from, but form, then we get the form element here. Okay. But watch what happens when we just go back to this normal route here. So without specifying any of the nested routes, well, then our sidebar is empty, which is not what we want. So here, when we come just to app, well, that didn't work. But anyway, in this application, when we come just to app, then we want to show by default also this city list here. So we can actually do that with something called an index route. So let's add that here. And so an index route is basically the default child route that is going to be matched if none of these other routes here matches. So right now that is the case here because basically we have nothing after that app path. So then none of these is matched. And so let's basically create a default here. So we call that index. And as we just said, here we want to again display the paragraph of list of cities. But it could be anything else really. So let's just try that for now. And I again forgot to close this route element. But in any case, now you see that we see this list here. And so that's because now of this index route. But now let's go back to list of cities. And so then this list of cities, which will later be its own component, will be the default here as soon as we open the application. And we could actually do the same thing with our homepage. So if we come here, we can remove this path and also make this an index route. And so if we now reload the application, then you see that by default, it goes here to our homepage. And now to finish, we want, of course, a way of moving between these different nested routes instead of having to manually write them here, right? So like this. So basically, we want now to implement this app navigation component. So let's go open that. And here we already have our styles. And so now all we need is this unordered list. And then just like before, a list of some nav links, which are again provided by React Router. And now here we can just specify exactly the path that we specified in our nested routes. So cities. And then let's do another one here. So another nav link, and this one here to countries. So again, repeating exactly the path that we specified here. Okay. So countries, and there we go. And since we are using this nav link here, then the element that is currently active automatically gets the active class. Remember that? And so in order to style that, we already have some code here again, which does that styling of the active class. All right, and so now as we click on these different links, then you see it moves to countries. And here goes back to list of cities. And for the form, I won't add a link here because later on that will actually open as soon as we click on the map here. So that's not part of this navigation. Now, if we think about this, then what we just implemented here is actually very similar to something like a tabs component, but implemented in a very different way. So before, if we wanted to implement a tabbed component where we have these tabs here, and then the content changes according to which is the active tab, we would have implemented that using the useState hook to manage the currently active tab. But here with React Router, we do the same thing, but in a very different way. So instead of using the useState hook to manage state, we basically allow React Router and the URL to store that state of the active tab. And so then whenever this URL here changes, then we change which tab is currently active. So React Router is a whole new way of thinking about how we build an application. Now, of course, that doesn't mean at all that all we have learned before is useless. So we still build components like accordions or tabbed components like the one I just mentioned using the useState hook all the time. But from now on, the overall navigation of the application is, in the real world, always managed by something like React Router. And so that includes a small sub-navigation like this one. So hopefully this wasn't too confusing, but just make sure to review all we just did. So how we implemented our nested routes here inside another route element. Then we rendered whatever the nested route wants to render inside the outlet component here. And then to actually switch between the nested routes, we implemented yet another navigation with these navlink components to basically link between the different URLs, which in this case are these sub URLs. So with the subroutes of cities and countries. Okay, and so once that is crystal clear, let's move on to actually implement this list of cities here. Now it's time to load our cities data from a fake API again, and then to actually render that data into the UI. And so let's start by actually creating the city list component. So citylist.jsx, and then we use our snippet, and let's also immediately bring in our CSS module. So our CSM snippet, and so now let's use that style object here in an unordered list. So styles.city list. And here for now, let's just write something. And so now here we want to finally replace this simple paragraph with the list of cities. So in this one and in the next child route actually as well. So city list, let's close that here, and the same thing here again. Give it a save, and then we get a problem. So what do we have here? So apparently it has something to do with the style, and here, of course, it needs to be class name. And yeah, that looks a lot better. Now, okay, so next up, let's actually set up our fake API again so that we can then fetch our city data from there. And so just like in the previous section, for that, we will install the JSON server package. So please go ahead and do that right now. And again, inside our current project folder. And then we will just come here to our package.json file and add right here a new script so that we can then run and start that JSON server right from our console. So let's call this one server, and the command will be JSON server watch, and then it's at data/cities.json. Then let's specify also the port at 8,000. And this time around, I also want to add an artificial delay so that it looks as if the API always takes half a second to actually fetch the data. So let's reload here just to get rid of that error. And now here, we should be able to run this. So npm run server. And here again, we have a problem where this is already in use. So let's try 9,000. And there we go. So now that works. So if we copy now this localhost and then 9,000, you see that, well, we don't really have our data, but that's because here I need to add /cities. And so here are 3 cities that we can now load into our application using the fetch function, just like before. So where are we going to do that? Well, we could do it right here in the city list, because this is where we will first need this data, but we will later on also need this data in some other places. And in particular, if we look at our demo here, we need it here also in these countries. So these countries will be derived from all the cities. And finally, we also need it to display these markers here. So each city gets its own marker with some data of the city. And so then there we will need that data again. And so let's just place that data, for now at least, here in the app component. So basically as global state that will be available to all components that we want to pass in using props. So let's create a new piece of state called cities, and then set cities, and then our use state hook starting with just an empty object. And then let's also get a quick is loading state and set is loading. All right. And then we want to load this data here right on mount. So let's use effect. So on mount. So on the initial render of this component. Now it doesn't make a lot of sense actually to load this data right as the entire application loads. For example, right here. So as it is right now, we actually start loading this city data even as we are only on this page here. So on one of these pages where we don't really need that data yet. But for now, let's just do it this way, because in the next section, we will even change this anyway. So let's define an async function here called fetch cities. And then here we are missing, of course, that function keyword. And so let's, as always, create a variable called res and then await a fetch request to our API. So let's just grab that there. And actually, let's place that URL outside. So at least this part here, but not the cities part. So this is basically our base URL. And now here we can construct our URL for the fetch based on this base URL. And so this then is a bit more reusable. So in case we will need to change this base URL later, then we don't need to search in our code for this fetch request. So then we need to await res.json and then set the cities with the data that we get back. Then in case there is some error, let's add a catch block and just alert something. Was an error loading data. And what's wrong here? Yeah, of course. I forgot to add that catch block, or that try block, actually. Then here we need to close this function. And then we need finally to set our loading state back to false. So set is loading to false. And of course, in the very beginning, we need to set it to true. So this is pretty standard stuff that we have been doing all the time here. Okay, and so right now, this should already been working at the very beginning. So when we first load our application, let's try that again. And if we check out our network tab, well, then we cannot really see that, but it should be there. So it's easier probably to check our component. And yeah, so here is our city data. And so now we want to pass that data so that here we can show a loading spinner, or we can show then the data itself. So let's do that. And so now we see the advantage of why here we need to use an element and not a component, because now we can very easily pass in that data. So cities will be cities, and then is loading equals is loading, and the same thing here. And don't worry about this duplicate code here, because we will actually get rid of these props when we start talking about context in the next section. But anyway, now let's use this data right here. And first of all, we need to accept that. So cities and is loading. And so now the first thing that we want to do is to, if is loading, then we want to just return a spinner here. So something indicating that the page is loading. And only if that's not the case, we want to then return this actual list. So we already have a spinner component, actually. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, so right here we have the spinner. And if you want, you can of course check out all the code for that. But anyway, let's now just import that really quick here. So from, and then spinner. Okay, but otherwise we want to, of course, render this list. And so, as always, what we do is to take our cities and then map over them. So for each city object, we want to create one city component. And so let's actually create that component here first. So let's then call that the city item.jsx. Okay. And so this will then take in the city. And here it will return one li. And let's just type city for now. And then here we can bring that city item in and pass as a prop the current city. So pretty standard stuff. And let's also define the key as the city.id. All right. And so here we have one city text for each of the cities. So let's reload this. And we have a problem. So cities.map is not a function. And I know why that is. It's because by default, here we have this empty object, which should actually be an empty array. So let's see. And very shortly, you saw the loading spinner there, which should have lasted a bit longer. So maybe we have some problem here with the delay. And here it should actually be 2 dashes like this. So then we need to quit the process with Control C and run it again. All right, try that again. And yeah, beautiful. That looked a bit better there. So it seems a bit more real this way. All right. And now this component here is now almost finished. And so let's take care of the city items themselves. So first of all, each of them has some styles. So let's import them here. And then the class name should be styles.city item. And we already see some change there. But now let's work on the content itself. So here the class is style.emoji, because here we will display the emoji. And let's actually destructure each of these cities. And to do that, let's first take a look at the shape of the objects. So right here, so we get the city name, the country, the emoji, the date, and some nodes. Now we're not going to need all of them, so let's just destructure the ones that we need. So we want the city name, of course, the emoji, and the date for now. And so that is going to come out of city. And so here, let's now use emoji. And then let's keep going. So class name styles.name. And then here, let's use the city name. Yeah, nice. This is already starting to look similar to what we have here. Now we're just missing the date. And then this button here, we will add it later. Or maybe we will actually add it now, but we can just give it no functionality. So here, let's actually use the time HTML element. And so then here, the date. And actually, let's format this date a little bit, because like this, it doesn't look really nice. And I think I have a function for that already here in the city component. So something like this. Let's just adapt this a bit. So placing this outside the component, of course, so that it doesn't always get recreated. So here, let's just remove the weekday, which we don't really care about. And so then let's wrap that date into a format date function call. Nice. So almost the same. Now let's just add this button and wrap that into parentheses here. Okay. And then the button itself. So a bit annoying that VS Code always places those quotes there. Maybe there's some way of changing that default. And if you know about that, then please let me know. But anyway, now here we have that button, which of course will not do anything now, but we will take care of that later. So this is starting to look really beautiful. And now to finish, let's just take care of the situation in which there is no cities yet. So imagining that the user uses the application for the very first time, then there will be no data yet. So let's duplicate this here, just so we don't lose the data. And then let's just remove everything. So we get just this empty array. So if we reload now, then we get nothing. We also don't get an error, but it looks a bit, well, empty like that. And so let's change that right here in the city list component. So we can do some more conditional rendering. We are already testing for that situation, but let's also say if there is no items, so if cities.length is non-existent, then let's return some other component that I also already included, which is this message component. So this is, again, just a presentational component, which all it does is to receive a message string. and then it displays that nicely in the UI with this emoji right there. So let's use that. And we pass in the message prop, lowercase please. Add your first city by clicking on a city on the map. All right. Of course, now our app doesn't know about this, but there we go. Beautiful. Now, of course, we cannot do that yet. And so let's just get all the data back here, give it a save, and delete this file. And so with this, we have actually finished this lecture. Let's now quickly build the list of all the countries that the user has already visited. And to show you what I mean by that, let's just copy two objects here and then place them here. And so let's just change them here to another city. So Barcelona here. And then if we reload, we should get all these 5 cities. Now here, why is there some problem? Now it's because the IDs are duplicate. So let's just put something random here. So React never likes duplicate IDs. But now the idea is that the user has been to these 5 cities, which means that they have been to these 3 countries. So Portugal, Spain, and Germany. And so now here in the countries list, we want to show a list of these 3 countries that the user have been to. So basically we want to filter out the duplicate countries here. So let's do that. We can leave this open. And so here we create the countries list.jsx component. And this one will actually be pretty similar to the city list. So let's just copy everything and paste that here. Now, of course, here we then need to change some things. So wherever it says city list, it should say countries list. So in the name of the CSS module and the name of the component and also the styles. But here, important that it is a lowercase c. Now here, we also receive the cities array into this component just like the city list. So here, right now, we also receive the cities array as a prop. And so from these cities, we can now derive the countries. Now, should we do that right here? Or maybe we can derive those countries from the cities right here in app, and then only pass those countries here into the component. So which option do you think is better? Well, I think it is actually a lot better to pass in the cities also into the countries list and then derive the countries from there, because that operation only needs to happen when this component here is executed. While if we had that calculation here, then that calculation would happen each time that the application re-renders. So each time this component is executed again. Right? So that's the kind of things that you need to start talking about or start thinking about as you start writing your own React applications. Okay, so here let's now then include the countries list, and we then, as we just discussed, pass in the cities state and also the isLoading state. Okay. Now here there's some problem apparently. So countries list doesn't exist for the CSS module, and that's because I called it here country list. And actually I like that name a bit better. And I guess that here in the style, so right here, the style is also called country list, so not countries. So let's change the name here very quickly to country. Then it will automatically update the imports, which is really nice. Then country list here, and let's make it lowercase. Then in app.js, we see that, yeah, it has successfully changed here. Now we just need to change the import name also to country list. So this is something that I do all the time, actually. So changing file names, and so it's good that this also happened here online on the video. Now also notice how I just moved this import here up, and so that's because it's kind of a convention to have all the imports from third-party libraries at the top, and then after that we import our own files. So that's just to make it a bit more organized. All right, so here we have now our countries list. This we don't need anymore. And so now we can derive basically a countries array from the cities array. So let's for now just start with an empty array here so that I can then replace cities here with countries. And here I need to fix that. And then here each of them is going to be a country. And here it is a country item. And this one I actually already included. No, not this one, but this one. So this very simple presentational component, there was no need to write it by hand. And so it's already here. So country item, and then let's just import that here. All right. And hopefully all of this doesn't seem too confusing or like it's going too fast. But, well, this is simply the reality of React development. You have all these different files, and it's usual that you just copy-paste some stuff between them from time to time. Okay. Now here this key is not going to work like this for now. So let's just delete it. And so with this, already our countries should be working. Of course, the countries will not display, but we at least don't get any error. So that's because the countries are still empty. But now let's take care of that, where we will derive this from the cities array. Now the idea is basically to create a new array which only contains the ones where the city name is unique. And so for a complex operation like this, I many times like to reach for the reducer method. And I'm sure there would be many other, maybe even more efficient ways of doing so, but this is just how I like to do it. And of course, I could already have included the code here as starter code, but I thought it might be a good idea to just walk you through the code as I'm writing it here. But anyway, so in each iteration of the reduce method, we get access to an accumulator and to the current value. So that's going to be the current city. And then here as a starter value, we want to start with an empty array. And so then into this array, we will place the new unique objects. So here we can just, let's call it array, the accumulator, and the current, it's just a city. Okay. And now let's start by checking if the array already contains the current city. So we can say the array, then we map over it, and then element.city, which will basically create an array of all the cities that are already in the countries array. And then we ask if this includes the current city, or actually the country in the current city. Okay, so if that is not the case, so if the current country is not yet in this array that we are creating here, well, then let's return a new array, which will contain all the current elements plus a new one. So here the country will be the current city dot country, and the emoji will be the current city dot emoji. And if not, so if the countries array already includes the current country, then we just return the current countries array, which is called array in this situation. Now here we have some problem. So we should probably wrap the entire function body here into this block, but still somehow it's complaining. Yeah, there we go. So let's check this, or actually we don't even need to check because it should then already work here. And that's not really working. So let's see. And here it should be, of course, the country. And there we go. So now only the 3 countries here that are unique basically remained right here in this array. So this is just a common JavaScript here, has nothing to do with React development. So that's why we don't need to go deep into how this code works. So basically all this does is as it loops over the city array, it keeps constructing the countries array, which starts at 0. So completely empty. And so then in each iteration, it asks if this array here already includes the current city. So the city that is currently being looped over. And if not, well, then we basically add a new object to that array, which contains the current country and the emoji. Okay, and so with that, we finish this list of countries here as well. Now it's time to take the usefulness of React Router to the next level by actually storing state in the URL so that we can use it in different places of the application. But you might be wondering, storing state in the URL, don't we actually use the useState hook to manage state? Well, that's true most of the time, but the URL is actually also an excellent place to store state, and especially UI state. And with UI state, I mean state that affects what the UI looks like. So things like an open or close panel, or a currently applied list sorting order or filter. So these examples of state are great candidates to be stored in the URL, and basically to be managed by the URL with React Router. Now, why would we want to do that? You might be asking. And that's, again, an excellent question. So the first reason is that placing state in the URL is an easy way to store state in a global place that is easily accessible to all components in the app. So before, if we wanted state to be accessible everywhere, we would have to store it in a parent component and then pass it all the way down to all child components using props. But if we place state in the URL, we can easily just read the value from there wherever the component is in the component tree. So basically, we can move some state management from React to the URL. Also, placing state in the URL is, in many situations, a good way to pass data from one page into the next page without having to store that data in some temporary place inside the app. And finally, another amazing reason why we should place UI state right in the URL is that doing so makes it possible to bookmark or to share the page with the exact UI state that the page had at the time that we are sharing or bookmarking it. For example, in an online shop, we might be filtering products by color and by price. And if that filter is saved in the URL, we can then share the page with someone and they will see the exact same filters applied to the list of products. So that's really helpful and enables a great user experience. Now, okay, but enough talking. Let's see how we can actually do this using React Router. So in a URL like this, we already know that we have a path. For example, app/cities. And we can consider this part state because it corresponds to the component that is currently being displayed. But this part is not really useful for state management in the way that I have been describing. So for actually storing state in the URL, we use params or the query string. Now, params, which stands for parameters, are very useful to pass data to the next page, while the query string is useful to store some global state that should be accessible everywhere. But to understand this a bit better, let's look at this example in more detail. So this URL that we just looked at corresponds to this view. And in the URL, you see that the param is Lisbon. And so, because of that, the page that was loaded is exactly about the city of Lisbon. So, by creating a link that points to a URL with this param, we are able to pass the city name to the next page whenever the user clicks on that link. And of course, if the URL had another city name as the param, let's say Berlin, then the loaded page would be about Berlin. And so that's the power of params, but there is more, because we also have the query string and it works in a very similar way. So in this example, we store the lat and lng pieces of state in the query string, which correspond to this position on the map. And the same is true, of course, for the other URL. So each of these cities has, of course, a unique location, and that location is reflected right in the URL. And so in this example, we leverage the power of the URL to manage state in an effective way by reading the city name and the GPS location from the URL instead of using application state inside React. Now, this probably looks all a bit confusing, which is why we're going to have plenty of opportunity to practice all this throughout the rest of the course, starting in the next video. So let's now use React Router params in order to pass some data between pages. So just like we have learned in the previous lecture. And to demonstrate what we're going to do, I'm back here in the demo app. And so as I hover over one of these items, watch the URL down here in the corner. So it's really small, but try to see it. So see that there we have app/cities and then / the ID of this city. And if we go to another one, then the ID changes. And so if I now click on this link, it will move there. And so now that ID is right here in the URL. And as you might have noticed, then this component down here used that URL to fetch the data about this city from the fake API. And so that's what I mean by passing data from one page to the other. So in this case, we passed the ID of 739 by clicking here and then reading that ID in this component from the URL. And so all without storing that data somewhere inside the React application, which we would have to do without React Router. Right? And so let's now implement the same thing here in our application. So to use params with React Router, we basically do it in 3 steps. So first we create a new route, then we link to that route, and then in that route, we read the state from the URL. So that's just a high-level overview. And so let's now do all of these steps one by one. And so first, we create a brand new route here. So let's do it right after the cities route here. So a new route with a path of cities. And now comes the special part. So this one is cities and then / and then whatever name we want to give the parameter. So let's call it ID in this case. And so the shape of this URL here is then exactly the same as this one. So cities slash whatever ID has been passed in. And then from there on, the rest is the same. So here, I want to now use the city component, which actually already exists. So let's write that here. And so here is that city component. So it already has some stuff in there, like this temporary data and all this JSX. Now here we just need to remove that button, and I will actually remove or comment out all of this return block. And instead, I just want to return for now, like an H1 saying city, because we will load the actual city data later on in the next section. Okay, and I keep forgetting to close these route components. Okay, and now all we have to do is to import the city component. So city like this. And so with this, we fixed all the bugs. So this was the first step, which was to create a route with this path linked to this city component. And so then whenever the URL takes this shape here, so cities slash something, it will then render the city component. Now, next up, as the second step, we actually need to link to this URL here, so to this route. And remember that we want to do so right here in each of these list items. So let's come to city item right here. And so now inside of each list item element, we will actually place a link. So one of these special links that comes from React Router. Let's just close this for now. And so then all of this stuff will go in there. And then we just need to change the class name from the list item to the link. So let's reload, and then that looks just like before. However, we are missing the to prop here, which is where now we will basically pass in the data that we want to pass from this page to the next one, so to the city one. So here we need actually a string. So let's create a template literal. And then all we want here is actually the city ID. So let's grab that here from the city object. And then let's just place that there. And so now if we save this, and if you see down here, then notice how we already see those new links there. Now, as we click here, then it actually moves, and here we get the URL. So we get that ID inside the cities slash ID URL, exactly like we have defined here. All right. And it's really important that here we only pass in the ID, because in this format, this will then simply add it to the current URL. While if we started this with a slash, then, so let's come back here. Then in that case, if we clicked, it would simply go to the root URL slash the ID. So that's not what we want. We want to basically attach this ID here to the end of the URL that we already have. All right, so let's try that again. And yeah, there it is. Now, in case you actually don't have the cities in the URL yet, so in case you just came here and now click here, then this whole thing is not going to work, because then we don't have the cities part. So it's important that first you click on cities so that the URL gets that cities, and then you can click here. So we will fix that later in the section, but for now, make sure that you first really activate this cities page. So the cities route, so to say. And so then again, once you click here, this ID from this city will get passed into the URL. And so then we move to this other component. And now in the third step, we can then read the data from the URL into this component. And with that, we will then finish this entire cycle. So let's come into the city component, and then in order to get that data from the URL, we use the useParam hook. So use params, which is once again provided to us by React Router. So it needs to be included here. And so this will then return something to us. So let's just call that x for now. And then I want to console.log that x. And immediately we saw down here what we got here. So we got this object with the ID that is right here. And if we went back, for example, to Faro, then here we got this 4545 ID. And the reason why this is called ID here is because that's the parameter name that we gave it here. So if we called this city, then down here it would be called city. So this here really determines the name of the data, so of this parameter that we're passing in. And so then here in the component where we consume this data from the URL, we usually immediately destructure that. So just like this. And so now the only thing that I want to do here is to then write that ID into this H1. So for now, this is all that we're going to do. But later then in the next section, we will use this ID to fetch all the data about the city from our API. Nice. So we just learned how to use this very important tool of React Router that are params. So let's quickly recap. So we created a new route right here. And of course, it wouldn't have to be a nested route. So we could have done this anywhere here. And here, let me just remove this actually. So of course, we could also have done like product/ID. So it wouldn't have to be a nested route, but this is just where this is useful in this application. But of course, in future applications that we're going to build, we will use params in some different place. But anyway, here we specify the name of the param and as always the element that should be rendered when the URL matches this path. Then we basically link to this route. So we create a link that we can actually move to this page here in our application. And we did so by passing in this data right here. So this ID of each city. And then as a final step, we read that data from the URL using this useParams hook. And now let's learn how to use the second way of storing state in the URL, which is the query string. And so in this lecture, I want to do exactly what I showed you in that slide 2 lectures ago. So where we added the position of the current city right here to the URL as a query string. So adding that data to the query string is actually really easy. All we have to do is to add it here to the path that the user will go to when they click on this link. So here we are in the city item component, which gets access to the current city. So basically, we are right here in each of these components. And so remember that each of them gets also access to a position object. So let's log that to the console. And so here there are. So here we have like each of these position objects for each of the cities. So it contains the latitude and the longitude. And so let's now add the latitude to our string. So here we are building this URL. So we already have the ID. And now we need the question mark and then the name of the state variable that we want to share, basically. Or we can also just call this another parameter, but a parameter of the query string. So let's call this one lat for latitude, then equal, and then finally let's add the dynamic data. So position dot let. All right. And so now when we click here on one of these links, then that moved right here into the URL. And it's important that it always follows this format. So first the regular URL, then the question mark, and then the variable name equal, and then the data itself. And of course, this would have worked on a non-dynamic route, so a route without this ID. So for example, like this, right? So it doesn't have to be a URL with a param in there. But anyway, we can add more. So for that, we just use the and symbol, and then we can just define another one. So let's go for the longitude here. And so position dot lng. And now we don't need to test this, but I still need to click here now again so that I can show you that the state that we had here inside our application was now transferred to the URL. So we have both the latitude and the longitude right now in this globally accessible URL. And so it is as if this data is now global state, which we can access from everywhere. So that includes, for example, here, this map component. So let's now move to this map component, which we already created earlier. And so in here, let's now try to read this latitude and longitude data from the URL. And so for that, we use the use search params custom hook that React Router gives us. So here it is, use search params. And this one is a bit similar to React's use state hook. So it returns an array which has basically the current state, which we usually call the search params. And then second, we get a function with which we can set the search params. So we can also update the search params in this way. Equals this. Okay. And now let's try to store first the latitude into this lat variable, because this data is actually not directly accessible on the search params. So it's not like an object that gives us this data here. Instead, it's an object onto which we need to now call the get method. So get, and then the name of the variable itself. So let, which is exactly this name right here. So this needs to match this. Okay, and then let's do the same for the longitude. So equal search params dot get lng. And so here let's now first display an h1 so that we can actually see something. And then here let's say position, and then the latitude and the longitude. Give it a save, and there it is. So this is exactly the data that we have here in our URL. And so basically with this, by clicking on one of these links in the list, we successfully share the state, so in this case the position state, with our entire application. So with every component that wants to access it. So now I clicked on this one, and then the position changed here to this one. And we can, of course, now use this in many different components. So let's grab this and move here into the city component, and let's do the same thing here. So of course now we need to include this again. So use search params, and so this then added it to the imports, exactly. And then let's return just something else here. So doing the same thing, position, lng, and then the latitude. Now here React is not happy. So let's do a fragment here in this case. So now this is really small, but the point is that the data is actually exactly the same. Not the same order, but well, that's not really that important. But once again, we were now able to pass this data here into all kinds of different components without having to store it anywhere inside our React application. So we didn't have to create any new piece of state, but instead we just stored it in the URL and then made it accessible everywhere. And so this is going to be really helpful here in the future to move the map to exactly the position of the city that was loaded here. So remember that we got the state here into the URL in the first place by passing it here into the link, so into the toProp of the link. So this is how we create a query string. But we can also then update the query string, as I mentioned before, using this setSearchParam functions. So let's do that here as well. So I will just create a temporary button here. Let's say change position with an onClick handler. And so here, let's just create a quick function because this is just to demonstrate. So here we can now say set search params. And then here we need to actually pass in an object with the entire new query string. So let's say the latitude should be 23 and the longitude should be, let's say 50. All right. So here we don't use the set function as you might expect, but instead we now need to pass in a brand new object here. And so let's see what happens. And there we go. And notice how actually this state has updated everywhere. And so that is really powerful. So it changed not only, of course, in the URL, but also everywhere in the application where this data is read. So it changed here to 2350 and the same thing here, even though it's really small, but notice how it did change really everywhere. Now, okay, and so now with all this in place, so with both the params and the query string now working, we can demonstrate one of the great advantages of having all the state stored in the URL that we talked about earlier, which is that now we can just take this URL and then, for example, share it with someone. So you can now copy this and then send it in some WhatsApp message or something like that. And then the other person can open up their browser, paste that URL there, open it up, and then they will see the page at exactly the same state. So we are in the same city here with the same position being displayed here and in the map. So this app looks exactly like this one. And so once again, that's because of the power of storing all the state that is relevant here right in the URL. And so with this, we made the application more shareable and also bookmarkable, if that's even a word. But anyway, as you just saw throughout these two lectures, using params and query strings really are amazing techniques that you are going to start using all the time once you start using React Router on your own. Next up, let's learn about programmatic navigation with the Use Navigate custom hook. So programmatic navigation basically means to move to a new URL without the user having to click on any link. And a common use case of this behavior is right after submitting a form. So many times when the user submits a form, we want them to move to a new page in our application automatically, so without having to click on any link. And so then we can use programmatic navigation to achieve that. So I'm sure you have seen that many times in action in some web applications that you have used. And so now let's do something like this here on our own. Now in this example, what I want to do is that whenever the user clicks somewhere here in this map container, we then want to move automatically here to the form component. So this is not the use case that I explained in the beginning. So after submitting a form, because by now we don't have any form yet, but we will do that later. But for now, let's just implement what I just said. So clicking here will then move right here to the form component. And clicking here cannot really happen with a link. And so that's why we need programmatic navigation. But first of all, let's set up our route correctly. So right here, we have form already. So we have our nested form route. But now here we actually want to include the form component. And this form actually has been given to us already in the starter data. So we already have that in our files. Let's just make sure that it has been included. And well, actually this is not the one that we want. So it included this one from React Router DOM, but we want our own one. So form, and so that's this one right here. So you see it already has all the input fields, even linked up with the state here, so that we don't have to do that manually again, because at this point we already know how that works. And so let's see. Yeah, this is now correctly linked. And so if we come back here and then type form, let's see, and beautiful. So here we have our form, but at this point we have no way of moving to this URL. And so again, we now want that to happen when the user clicks somewhere on the map here. So let's do that. And so let's attach an event handler here on click, and then here our function. Okay, and we will finish this function later, because before we can keep going, we now need to actually use the use navigate hook. So another hook that is provided by React Router. So use navigate. And all this one does is to return a function called navigate, like this. And so then we can use this function here to basically move to any URL. So we just need to call that here. And so let's say we want to move to the form, and that's it. So let's go somewhere else. At least it should be here in the app. And so now let's see what happens when I click somewhere here. And indeed, it did move to the form. So without us having to click on any link. So this is programmatic navigation, where we basically, in an imperative way, navigate to this URL. So here in a nav, we do that also. So we also navigate to another page, but in a declarative way, because we just declare this component in our JSX, and that will then do the work of navigating to the city's URL for us. But in this case, again, we do it in an imperative way, because we cannot use the link in this situation. And the same, again, after submitting a form. So then we would have to also call this navigate function. And so we will do that later. So this is one use case of the navigate function, but we can also do something else, which is to simply navigate back, which is in fact something that we cannot do just with links. So let's try that out by coming here to the form. And so here we actually have a button to go back. And so now we want to implement that functionality. But before we do that, I now want to create actually a reusable button component. So let's create a new file here, button.jsx. And here it is now a button element. And then let's see what we need here as props. So we need the children prop so that we can pass in some content. Then we also need to accept the onClick prop. And finally, here I also want to accept a type string. And so using that type, I then want to conditionally add a CSS class. But let me show that to you in the end. So first, let's do our typical things, which is to allow the user to attach an onClick event handler to this button. Okay, then we also need to get in our styles. And then let's add the class name here, styles.btn. Okay, so let's come back here and use that button. And for now, we don't pass in here the onClick event handler, as we will do that later. So here we got some styling already, but that is not enough. So let's come here to the CSS module for the button and notice that besides the button class, we have these 3 other classes. And so now we want to allow the user to pass in a type, which can be either primary or back or position. And then according to that, we will add the corresponding class. So what I mean is this. So instead of now manually passing in here a class name, we just pass in a string with the type of button that we want. So here we want a primary button. And so then here we receive that inside the button as the type, and then we will use that as a class name here. So this means that now we need to add 2 class names. And the way we do that in CSS modules is that we need to create a template literal. So let's wrap this first in backticks, then into this curly braces. And then here, let's do the other one. So for example, here we could say now styles.primary. And so then all the buttons would get green like this, because the primary is the one with the green background. But remember that actually here we want the type. And so here we now need to do it like this. And so here we get indeed the primary type. But if we use now the back button, so let's do that, then we will get another style. So type of back, and then let's see what we got. And beautiful. So we basically dynamically now selected the style that we want using this type prop string. So let's close that. And now finally, let's attach the onClick handler here so that we can again use the navigate function right here now. So let's include our custom hook again. So use navigate from React Router DOM. And by the way, this used to be called use history in a previous version of React Router. And so now we want to navigate back. So how do we do that? Well, we just need to define basically the number of steps that we want to go back in the browser's history. So if we say -1, then that means that we basically navigate back. So let's try that out here. And moving to cities. And then as I click here, that will open the form. And so now when I click here, we should move back to cities, right? Well, that didn't really work. I mean, maybe you saw a flash of this moving back, but then it reloaded the page here again. And so the reason for that is that this button is located inside a form. So we are inside a form, and so therefore this will trigger the form to be submitted. And so that will then cause the page to reload. So what we also need to do here is to prevent default. So we need to receive the event, and then we need to do e.prevent default. And so this will then prevent this button as it is clicked to submit this form. So let's try that again. Clicking here will open this. And now as we move back, we are back here in this URL. And if I go to countries, then click here again and click back, then we move back to countries. And of course, we could also move forward by doing +1 here, or we could move back twice by doing -2. But usually what we always need is just like this. Okay, and that's actually it. That is programmatic navigation for you. Now here I'm just noticing we have some problem. So something with the country list. So country list, I remember that we removed the key from here, but we never put it back. So let's just use the country dot country, which is unique in this situation. So let's reload, and then we get no more error. So we learned about how to programmatically navigate using the useNavigate hook. But there is also a declarative way of doing that. And so let's now check out the navigate component. Now, since we have React hooks, the navigate component that we're going to learn about now is not so much used anymore. But there is still one very important use case for it, which is inside nested routes. So let me show you what I mean by that. So let's come all the way back to the beginning here, and then let's go to our application. And so notice how right now we are not in app/cities. And so that's why here, then this button is actually not selected. While if we click here, only then we move here to /cities and it gets activated here as well. So in order to fix this, we can now basically use the navigate component to immediately navigate to this URL. So let me show you how. So right now we have both the index route and the cities route pointing to the exact same element. So both of them simply include the city list. But here in the index route, let's now change that and let's instead use the navigate component that React Router DOM gives us. And so then here, just like in the links, we can specify the to prop. And so then, as you can guess, let's write cities. And so this is then basically like a redirect. So you can think of this navigate component here also like a redirect. So as soon as the index route is hit, it will then basically redirect us to the cities route, which is this one right here. And so if we go back again and click now, then immediately we got redirected to the place that we wanted. So immediately now we have cities, and here of course it is marked as active. Now the problem is when we want to go back here, because notice how as we click here, nothing really happens. And so to fix that, here we need to add the replace keyword, because this will then replace the current element in the history stack. All right, so let's try that again. And here we are. And if we want to move back, then we are back to where we were before. And that's actually it. So I think this is the main use case right now for this navigate element, but still keep this in mind here as you might need it in other situations. So basically situations where you cannot use the navigate function coming from the useNavigate hook. So in this case here, that wouldn't really work. And so then we use this more declarative way. So declarative because we just declare this in our JSX that we want to basically navigate or to redirect to this other URL here. While with the navigate function, it is really an imperative way where we really tell our JavaScript code that we want to go to that other URL. Now, okay, and so that does it for this video. And actually, we even finished this section. So we will keep working on this project in the next section, but now we are ready to add something called context to this project. And so to do that, we first need to learn about what that is in a small intermediate project before coming back to this one. And so let's now move on to the next section, which is going to be all about that context API that I just mentioned there. So hopefully I see you back there very soon.